CNN Breaking News.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We have breaking news about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into possible Russian meddling in the 2016 election. The Wall Street Journal is now reporting that Mueller has impaneled a grand jury right here in Washington, D.C., suggesting that the investigation is entering a new heightened phase. Grand juries being powerful investigatory cudgels that permit putting witnesses under oath or issuing subpoenas or, of course, possibly indictments. But now we're going to talk about something else. We'll talk about the Journal story in a second. Let's turn to more breaking news being broken by CNN right now. Remarkable reporting giving us a look inside the actual investigation that Mueller and the FBI are conducting. The diligent and detailed efforts of investigators, what they are looking at, why, possible targets in the probe. Let's bring in CNN's Pamela Brown with this reporting. And Pamela, what are you learning about the focus of the special counsel's investigation?
Well, bottom line is that it's expanding. We're learning some new details, Jake, that give us an inside look into how the focus of the Russia probe is crossing over what President Trump says is a red line that investigators should not cross as this investigation enters its second year.
Does anyone really believe that story?
The Russia investigation continues to widen as federal investigators explore the potential financial ties of President Trump and associates to Russia. Sources tell CNN financial links could offer a more concrete path to any potential prosecution. For the president, that's going too far. He's warned that delving into his businesses is a, quote, violation. Trump has maintained there's no collusion and he has no financial ties to Russia.
And I can tell you, speaking for myself, I own nothing in Russia. I have no loans in Russia. I don't have any deals in Russia.
Now, 1 year into this complex probe, the FBI has reviewed financial records related to the Trump Organization, the president himself, as well as his family members and campaign associates. CNN is told investigators have combed through the list of shell companies and buyers of Trump-branded real estate properties. They've scrutinized the roster of tenants at Trump Tower in Manhattan, reaching back several years. And officials familiar with the investigation tell CNN Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team has examined the backgrounds of Russian business associates connected to Trump.
From Moscow, it's Miss Universe 2013.
Dating back to the 2013 Miss Universe pageant he hosted in Moscow.
Thank you to Aras Agalarov and the focus group for their amazing hospitality.
CNN could not determine whether the review has included Trump's tax returns. But even investigative leads that have nothing to do with Russia but involve Trump associates are being referred to the special counsel to encourage subjects of the investigation to cooperate.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt.
President Trump, keenly aware of the increased financial focus, regularly denounces the investigation.
Russia is fake news. This is fake news put out by the media.
Trump's team seeking to limit Mueller's investigation.
The president's point is that he doesn't want the special counsel to move beyond the scope and outside of its mission. And the president's been very clear, as have his accountants and team, that he has no financial dealings with Russia. And so I think we've been extremely clear on that.
CNN has learned new details about how Mueller is running his special counsel team. More than 36 attorneys, FBI agents, and support staff, experts in investigating fraud and financial crimes, broken into groups focused separately on collusion and obstruction of justice. There is also focus on targets like Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, and General Michael Flynn, his fired national security advisor. CNN has learned that investigators became more suspicious of Manafort when they turned up intercepted communications that U.S. intelligence agencies collected among suspected Russian operatives, discussing their efforts to work with Manafort to coordinate information that could hurt Hillary Clinton's bid for the White House, according to U.S. officials. In Flynn's case, the focus is now on his lobbying work for the Turkish government, which he failed to initially disclose as required by law. While both men deny any wrongdoing, the approach to the Manafort and Flynn probes may offer a template for how the focus by investigators on possible financial crimes could help gain leverage and cooperation in the investigation.
And the president's attorney, Jay Sekulow, said to CNN in a statement that the president's outside legal counsel has not received any requests for documentation or information about this. And he says any inquiry from the special counsel that goes beyond the mandate specified in the appointment, we would object to. And just for context, Jake, investigators don't necessarily have to go to the president's legal counsel to get the finances. You can issue a subpoena to financial institutions such as banks, and you can go to the Treasury Department for records as well.
All right, Pamela Brown, stick around. We got a lot to talk about. Let's bring in your colleagues in the story, Evan Perez and Shimon Prokupecz. Also on the phone, we have with us CNN senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Evan, let's talk about the story that had to do with Paul Manafort. Why were investigators interested in him initially, and how significant might that be for the investigation?
Well, one of the things that happened, Jake, was that the investigators got a hold of intercepts. This was communications between suspected Russian operatives talking about what they said were interactions with Paul Manafort. They said that he was interested in encouraging their cooperation, providing some information on Hillary Clinton, dirt on Hillary Clinton that could help with the campaign. So what we don't know is whether or not those Russian operatives, or suspected Russian operatives, were telling the truth, whether they were exaggerating, whether they were making it up. And certainly one of the problems for investigators is trying to piece all that together without the benefit of knowing whether or not these people, again, these are people overseas, whether they were actually telling the truth. Obviously, Manafort's problems go beyond that. However, he has some serious financial issues going back to his business dealings with the former ruling party in Ukraine, and whether or not there were money laundering and tax issues there. So that is also a part of this investigation.
Interesting. Jeffrey Toobin, let me bring you in. Turning back to the Wall Street Journal scoop about Mueller impaneling a grand jury here in Washington, D.C. What is the significance of that? Does that necessarily mean he's planning on bringing charges?
It's very important, Jake, to answer that question. And the answer to that question is no. Just because there's a grand jury does not mean that anyone is going to get indicted. However, no one can be indicted without a grand jury first being impaneled. So it is significant that he has taken this step. It is also significant because grand jury subpoenas are the way that prosecutors can get sworn testimony under oath, sworn testimony from people in the investigation. You send them subpoenas and they then testify in the grand jury. It's also possible to issue grand jury subpoenas, which is the main way prosecutors collect evidence, to phone companies, to banks, to individuals to produce their financial records. So it's a very important step, but I think it is important that we not overstate how important it is and not suggest that this means that criminal charges are inevitable or even going to happen.
And Shimon, let me ask you, the probe in CNN's reporting, you're reporting with Evan and Pamela, looking at these possible financial ties between President Trump and various Russians. How significant could that be, and how far back are investigators looking?
Well, what we've learned, Jake, is that this goes back at least a half a dozen or so years. And, you know, what better place than sort of follow the money here? Because we keep hearing that there's different properties, different real estate transactions that may involve Russians and people within the Trump world, certainly some of his family members. So what we're told is that the FBI has now gone far as back as Miss Universe pageant, which was in 2013 in Russia. And they've sort of been looking at the relationships that the president may have cultivated there, some of his interactions with Russians there, and of trying to sort of kind of piece a puzzle of what exactly was going on there. And we've also learned that they've actually looked at some of his financial records, some of the real estate records at Trump Tower in New York, and that they have found some very interesting connections to Russians throughout the years. So all of that is now a significant part of this investigation. It's part of the investigation, the financial investigation, into people even including his family members.
And President Trump very clearly drew a red line. The red line was the New York Times reporter's term, but President Trump agreed with it, that if they were looking at his finances, that would be a red line, suggesting possibly that he would then try to fire Bob Mueller. How much is that weighing on investigators?
Yeah, I mean, you know, based on what the people we've talked to, certainly, they're continuing to do their jobs. The authority given to the special counsel certainly allows him to go outside of the probe of just collusion. It's anything that has to do with really with the Trump world, with Trump organization, with the family members. So this is not stopping, this sort of red line issue is not stopping any of the investigators. You know, there have been other subpoenas issued in this investigation, and they're just continuing to do their work. Obviously, there is some concern for them, for the investigators going forward, but, you know, they're just doing their job here.
And Pamela, does the fact that Mueller and his investigators, and he's hired a lot of lawyers who have expertise in financial crimes, does the fact that they are so focused on Trump's financials indicate that they are no longer looking at collusion?
No, I mean, from what we've been told through our sources, they are still focused on collusion, the idea that there was some coordination between the Russians and Trump campaign associates. But there are some obstacles in prosecuting along the lines of collusion because so much of the evidence stems from these intercepts, as Evan was talking about, foreign intercepts. So you have foreign witnesses that the FBI can't just go and interview, and then you have to verify it. Well, how do you verify it? Because they could have been exaggerating or lying. And so I think that is part of what has led investigators down the road of the financial avenue, as one would put it, to look to see if any more crimes were committed, but also to see if that could give them leverage in terms of encouraging cooperation among some of the subjects in this investigation. As I pointed out in my story, a lot of the leads that are coming into DOJ that have nothing to do with Russia collusion are still going to the special counsel probe. They want to see everything they can for see if crimes were committed, but also to see if they could gain leverage in the investigation.
And Jeffrey Toobin, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add one point about this collusion issue, is that, yes, that is the origin of this investigation, but there is no such federal crime as collusion. The question of any sort of collaboration between the Trump campaign and Russian officials or Russian business people, it is not clear if that is criminal. So what is certainly criminal is financial crimes like money laundering, like tax crimes. And so that's another reason why it would be very important to establish, to establish the financial background for this case. Also, but is the question of motive. I mean, why would Russia and why would the Trump campaign collude with Russia? If there is evidence of financial ties, that would allow Mueller to establish the issue of motive, which is always important in a criminal case. And that also raises the issue of obstruction of justice, the firing of Director Comey. That certainly is part of this investigation as well. So, I mean, there is a lot to look into here, though charges are by no means assured.
And just for perspective as well, on the heels of what Jeffrey said, part of why the FBI has been so interested in knowing what the Russians did was the concern on a blackmail. Could the Russians have some sort of financial leverage to have blackmail over the president or any of his associates? So that's another reason why they want to see what is there and whether there should be any concern.
And Evan, another player in all this is Carter Page, of course. He was cited in the campaign by then Mr. now President Trump as one of his national security advisors, member of his team. What are you learning about the focus on Carter Page?
Well, we've learned, Jake, that the interest in Carter Page certainly goes back much further. We know that we now know that he was a subject of a FISA, the secret surveillance warrant, that goes back at least a couple of years, not just last summer, which is what had been previously reported. And that is interesting because it's part of why the FBI suddenly took notice last summer and started this investigation. They noticed that this is a guy who had been interacting with Russians. He certainly had traveled to Moscow, did a very pro-Russia speech last summer, and then he starts becoming a lot more involved in the campaign. That really raised their curiosity and their interest because they wanted to know whether he was being used to get into the campaign, to spy on the campaign.
All right. Thanks one and all for being here. Really appreciate it. We have lots to discuss on our breaking news with our panel coming up. How will President Trump react to his so-called red line being crossed by investigators and the report in the Wall Street Journal that a grand jury has been impaneled right here in D.C., just blocks away from the White House? Stick around.
The Lead with Jake Tapper.
Well, he said he was going dark, and now that appears to be the case for the moment. Anthony Scaramucci just yanked his plans to reveal his side of the story publicly tomorrow. The man who calls himself the Mooch was set to discuss his dramatic White House exit as in his 11 days as communications chief in a live event online. Scaramucci announcing his quick change of heart just recently on Twitter, writing no press event tomorrow, focusing on family. might work in the private sector. Hashtag moving forward. Stay tuned. Now, that just happened, but we also today have this audio of Scaramucci's shocking late-night phone call with New Yorker journalist Ryan Lizza. Yes, that interview. And Scaramucci unleashed this blistering and bleep-filled rant, launching brutal attacks on key members of Trump world, a la Reince Priebus.
Who leaked that to you?
Oh man, I can't tell you that.
What's that?
I can't tell you that. But
Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I will eliminate everybody in the comms team and we'll start over. So it's no problem. So I asked these guys not to leak anything, and they can't help themselves, so we'll eliminate everybody. So was somebody in the comms team leaked that to you? Okay, but you're an American citizen. This is a major catastrophe for the American country. So I'm asking you as an American patriot to give me a sense for who leaked it.
the only thing I can tell you is two people in the White House who I know wouldn't lie to me. You know what I mean?
So like who?
Come on, I can't tell you, buddy. You know I can't do that.
So go. You can give me. Is it an assistant to the? Is it an assistant to the? Is it assistant to the president? And Reince is a paranoid schizophrenic, paranoiac. And what he's going to do is, maybe Bill Shine's coming. So let me leak the thing and see if I can block these people the way I blocked Scaramucci for 6 months. Okay, but he leaked the CFIUS stuff on me. My financial disclosure's been leaked to Politico, which is a felony.
I wanted to ask you if you wanted to be profiled.
I don't want to be profiled.
Well, just
I'm
what
not
you're
Steve
trying
Bannon.
to do. What you're trying to do.
I'm not Steve Bannon.
No.
I'm not trying to suck my own. I'm not trying to build my own brand off trying to the president. Okay, the mooch showed up a week ago. This is going to get cleaned up very shortly, okay? Because I nailed these guys. I got digital fingerprints on everything that they've done through the FBI and the Department of Justice.
What's the worst thing?
No. Oh, well, the felony, they're going to get prosecuted probably for the felony. They'll probably get prosecuted for that.
Wowza, Ryan Lizza, good enough to join me from vacation on the phone. Ryan Lizza, my goodness, I mean, it was one thing to read your interview with him in print. It is quite another to hear the bleeps out loud. I mean, you labeled this interview in your computer as insane Scaramucci interview. Was that the craziest phone call you've ever had with a high government official?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, when I got off the phone, I thought that was just the most unusual conversation, because if you just to summarize what he was saying there, he said he threatened to fire the entire communications staff if I wouldn't reveal sources, which I thought was a very strange threat to offer a journalist. It's not like that would be an incentive for me to change my mind about that. He launched those pretty serious attacks on his colleagues, and probably the most newsworthy thing is he said he called the FBI on the chief of staff at the White House. I mean, just consider that for a moment. I mean, we're talking like a Watergate level, news there. Like, I've never heard of a high government official telling a journalist that they've called the FBI to investigate a colleague at the White House. So I got off the phone and immediately thought, all right, this is extremely newsworthy. We got to figure out what to do with it.
So looking back on his 11-day tenure, this was the let Trump be Trump guy, right? I mean, we heard that through the campaign.
Yeah.
It kind of became cliche, but this is how. What was he, in terms of being the head of the communications shop? This is how he was trying to convince people to go, right? Which obviously something changed once Reince Priebus was out and General Kelly was in.
I think it's a mixed bag, because if you read the communications memo that he wrote that leaked out yesterday, a lot of communications professionals in politics and a lot of journalists who were reading it yesterday, their reaction was, he had some good ideas there.
He did.
And on the plus side of the ledger, he was trying to open the White House up a little bit more, get the cameras back on in the briefing room. He was really emphasizing having a better relationship with the press. So those were all positive things. I think on the side of the ledger that if he had stayed, not so sure how it would have went, is that he believed that the real problem in the White House was that the public just didn't see the side of Trump that he saw. He had this very worshipful view of Trump, and just believed that all the problems could be solved as if the world saw Trump the way he saw. And I think a lot of people in politics think that everything's just a communications problem, that all the politicians' issues with the public could be solved with slightly better communications, when usually it's a lot deeper than that. So I think it was a mixed bag. I think he's getting, hammered a little unfairly on some of these things. But you have to understand why the new chief of staff would say it's just intolerable to have someone who is sort of super empowered by the president reporting to the president rather than the chief of staff. I think you can understand why John Kelly wanted to have a fresh start.
Yep. Within the first 6 hours of his first day there at the White House. Ryan Lizza, thank you so much. Go back to your vacation. I would have asked you, what do you think is going on with this public address tomorrow? But he scrapped it. So wish him well, obviously, in his personal life. Ryan Lizza, thank you for calling in. Coming up next, this young woman who was convicted for involuntary manslaughter for texting her boyfriend to commit suicide. She learns her fate today. She could face up to 20 years in prison. We're watching the courtroom there. There she is, white shirt. And that to you. Also, where is Sean Spicer? He has a few more days in the West Wing. What's he up to? And what are the plans for Spicy when he's out of the White House? That's coming up.
She's national.
Welcome back to watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. A reportedly frustrated President Trump has just held this closed-door meeting with his national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, as the White House is facing some tough questions about its promised new strategy in Afghanistan. So we've got Barbara Starr, who's live for us at the Pentagon, and we have retired Brigadier General Anthony Tata, who's a former Deputy Commander General of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. So welcome to both of you. And Barbara Starr, just reminding everyone, there are nearly 9,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. What kind of indication are you getting as far as policy moving forward?
Well, at the moment, it's not moving, and by all accounts, that is what is frustrating the president. In fact, later today, yet another meeting scheduled at the White House. The president not expected to attend, but his top advisors, once again, sitting down, trying to hammer out a way ahead. The big problem they're facing with a way ahead in Afghanistan right now is they can't agree on what to do. All of the options are there, but and they range from complete withdrawal, pulling all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, all the way to adding additional troops to help train Afghan forces so they can buy enough time for the Afghan forces to be able to be better trained and look after their own security. But there is a contingent in the White House that is asking the key question: why, after all these years, if the Taliban are still fighting, if ISIS is still fighting there, why is the U.S. still there? Is it a war that's winnable? And Defense Secretary James Mattis has said, we are not winning this war, referring to the U.S. military, and not winning is not something that President Trump wants to hear. So he is very frustrated and looking for a way ahead, we're told.
All right, Barbara, thank you. So, General Tata, I mean, you were the perfect person to talk to. You know the lay of the land. Clearly, we hear from Barbara. The president's frustrated. We know that General McMaster has been at odds with him over, committing more troops to the mission, a plan that he supports, but the whole Bannon wing, the White House is against. How do you think the concerns should be addressed?
Well, Brooke, I can tell you that the person that is most frustrated would be General Mick Nicholson. And if we back up a little bit, Mick has been a commander there in one way, shape, or form since 2006. He's a colonel in Afghanistan when he worked for me. He was a brigadier general there, major general, lieutenant general, now four-star general. Last 11 years, his life has been dedicated to Afghanistan and improving the lives of Afghan folks and to improving the security of Afghanistan so that terrorists can't have sanctuary there. That's the real mission, is to prevent sanctuary, because that's where 9/11 was planned. That's where Al-Qaeda took the Taliban. And the goal is to prevent that from happening again. So I think the first thing that the president and his national security team should do is expose that land, that terrain, that army, that enemy better than Mick Nicholson. And relationships are everything in this part of the world. And Mick would be the first to tell you that. General Mattis would, H.R. McMaster would, even Kelly, the new chief of staff. They all know Mick. They all know that he's the right guy, whether it's with relationship with Pakistan or any of the stands surrounding Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. Mick Nicholson is the right guy. So the first, you start this conversation by saying, we've got the right guy there. And then you start talking. talking about
just
fishing.
staying, if I may, sir, just jump in on your exact point. I mean, you would agree then with what John McCain, tweeted today, defending precisely the person you're talking about. This is what he said. If you haven't seen it, our commanders in chief, not our commanders in the field, are responsible for the failure in Afghanistan. So, what about the commanders in chief piece? What do you make of the senator's very sharp message on specifically the commanders in chief?
McCain is right on point. This dates, you and I have talked before, Brooke, this dates all the way back to the Bush administration, where you had Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld all not knowing what they were doing. And they pulled, the one time our nation asked for a hit on a platter, Osama bin Laden, and we pull out of Afghanistan all the communications, all the intelligence, all of the combat enablers necessary to provide Osama bin Laden to the American people and cut the head off of that al-Qaeda snake, and we go over to Iraq to do what we did there. That was a strategic error, in my opinion. I said it back then, and I'll say it again. I was a commander in the 101st Airborne at the time, told I was going to Afghanistan, and then got told I was going to Iraq. I said, what for? And so this dates, McCain is right, this dates all the way back to the 01, 02 timeframe, where we made some very bad strategic assumptions, and it just continued through the Obama administration. And I think what President Trump is trying to do is hopefully get it right. And we either need, as Barbara said, either fully get out or fully get in. But right now we're at the 9,000-10,000 troops. And if we get out, we have to understand sort of the law of unintended consequences. So when we pulled out of Iraq, you see what happened with ISIS. They took years. We turned our backs on Iraq. ISIS grew, and then we had this pan-national threat, this transnational threat that really spans all across Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And so if we get out of Afghanistan without having properly built the capacity to defend that country and prevent terrorists from taking host in there, then we could very well have a replay of that. And now the ISIS has moved to partly in Afghanistan and partly in Libya. Why Libya? Right. Because it's ungoverned space. So we have to understand that if we get out, this is what we're going to have to deal with.
No, I'm hanging on your every word, General, and I think my biggest takeaway, listen to Nicholson, hopefully that is precisely what the Commander-in-Chief is doing, and you're exactly right. Iraq is hopefully less than General Tata. Thank you, as always, so much. Coming up, Anthony Scaramucci planning his next move after that explosive, profanity-laced interview with the New Yorker led him to parting ways after 11 days with the White House. So we now have audio of that call. And the man on the other end of the phone, that other end of that interview, New Yorker's Ryan Lizza. We've got him coming up live. Also, the woman. Hi there, I'm Brooke Baldwin. You're watching CNN. As President Trump heads to what is expected to be a campaign-style rally tonight in West Virginia, new leaked transcripts show the president getting combative over the optics of one key campaign promise, building that wall. Mexico's paying for it. Washington Post obtained the verbatim of the president's official phone call with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Happened in January, 1 week after the inauguration. And let me just read for you what apparently President Trump said. Quote, "But the fact is we are both in a little bit of a political bind because I have to have Mexico pay for the wall. I have to." Later on, President Trump says, "You and I are both at a point now where we are both saying we are not to pay for the wall. We cannot say that anymore because if you are going to say that Mexico is not going to pay for the wall, then I do not want to meet with you guys anymore because I cannot live with that. I am willing to say that we will work it out, but that means we'll come out in the wash. That is okay." As to comment on these transcripts, a spokesman for the National Security Council said that he could not confirm or deny, quote, the authenticity of allegedly leaking classified documents. Go to the White House, Caitlin Collins. And Caitlin, let's talk a little bit more. In that conversation, he's also essentially saying to the Mexican president, and by the way, stop saying this so publicly to the press.
Yeah, he said basically we can work this out between ourselves, but let's not have it out there. He was pressuring him to not be publicly defiant about paying for this wall. But I'd like to bring your attention to another part of this transcript that is getting a lot of attention today, and that's a comment the president made about the state of New Hampshire. He was making an argument for why we need a wall along the southern border to stop drugs from coming in when he called out New Hampshire specifically. He said, "We have drug lords in Mexico that are knocking the hell out of our country. They are sending drugs to Chicago, Los Angeles, and to New York. Up in New Hampshire, I won New Hampshire because New Hampshire is a drug-infested den." Now, as you can guess, Brooke, the governor of New Hampshire was not too happy when he heard this comment. He said the president was wrong and that it was a mischaracterization.
And in addition, we were just checking some of the numbers. I think it was Hillary Clinton who won in New Hampshire by a couple thousand votes.
Yes,
with regard to that fact. In addition, there was the transcript from the call with the PM in Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. Tell me about that.
So that one was an equally contentious call. It started out on a good note. They were talking about mutual friends that they had. But as it wore on, we saw them begin to argue over the subject of a deal the Obama administration made with Australia to take in some of these refugees that are living in Australian detention centers. Now, Trump became increasingly agitated during this call, saying, "This is going to kill me. I am the world's greatest person that does not want to let people into the country. And now I'm agreeing to take 2,000 people. And I agree I can vet them, but that puts me in a bad position. It makes me look so bad. And I've only been here a week." Turnbull then argued that it wasn't 2,000 people. It was a little less than that. But Trump said, "Well, it's close. I've even heard 5,000 as well." Trump then told one of our closest allies that his conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin had gone much smoother than that, saying, "Look, I spoke to Putin, Merkel, Abe of Japan, to France today, and this was my most unpleasant call. Because I'll be honest with you, I have had it. I've been making these calls all day. This is the most unpleasant call. Putin was a pleasant call. This is ridiculous." But, Brooke, I'd like to point out that back in February, when details of this conversation that Trump had with Turnbull first leaked, saying that it was a contentious talk, Trump got on Twitter and said that that was fake news and a lie and that they had a very civil discussion. But as you and I can both see from the transcript, it certainly was not.
Caitlin, thank you so much. Leaked transcripts run counter to the president's tweet from February. That is when the contentious call between himself and Malcolm Turnbull first broke. This is what Caitlin was alluding to. The president said, quote, "Thank you, Prime Minister of Australia, for telling the truth about our very civil conversation that fake news media lied about." Very nice. Not the case. Let's talk about all this. Sabrina Siddiqui is with us, political reporter for The Guardian. CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger, who's also national security correspondent for The New York Times, and CNN military and diplomatic retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, former spokesman for both the Pentagon and the State Department. So, Sabrina, let me start with you. Let's take these in order. First, just with the Mexican president conversation. And to me, the biggest takeaway with this is that essentially the president is saying to Peña Nieto, "Listen, we'll figure out who's going to pay for this thing. It's going to come out in the wash," paraphrasing. But you know, stop saying you're not paying to the press. It's all about optics.
It is indeed, and I think it's striking that for someone who fashioned himself as a candidate, as a great negotiator, who is going to come in and strike deals with foreign leaders in a way that his predecessors were unable, Trump was so quickly willing to concede that one of his primary campaign promises was, in fact, bluster, that it doesn't really matter who pays for the wall. He's much more focused on the perception and on a political win versus a loss and how it would be received if he was unable to meet a campaign promise. And also this assumption that the president of Mexico is going to adopt one of Trump's most controversial campaign positions, which he had repeatedly criticized all along. I think it's also striking that Trump, we know how he speaks publicly, but even in private, he was aggressive, if not disrespectful, toward two close U.S. allies. And clearly, even in private, he didn't really show a respect for the diplomatic relations and norms with which you would expect these conversations to transpire.
Let me take the first part of that. And David Sanger, let me ask you. I actually spent my evening and sat down with a number of Trump supporters, and we went around the table. And one of my last questions to them was, all right, if he has 4 years, what's the one promise he can't afford to break? And I heard build the wall, and Mexico is going to pay for it. So if, Trump supporters are reading the transcript, how are they feeling today?
Well, I now know what we've all known, which is that this is going to be a bit of a problem all through. And that one instance is self-inflicted, that he made this promise that they would pay for it, even though the wall's on the U.S. side. When you talk to people who have put on the wall, what I tell you is, even if they present to him other options, what this wall looks like, that in places where you couldn't have a physical wall, you'd have electronic monitoring, or you'd have some other kind of barrier. He agrees with it, and then at the end he says, listen, when you talk about this publicly, it's a wall. And that's because to his supporters, the two important things, as you pointed out, Brooke, are that they talk about a wall, even if it really isn't one, and they find a way for Mexico to pay for it, even if they don't.
Let me move on, Admiral Kirby, to you on this call with the Australian Prime Minister. Again, just for people understanding, this is early on in his presidency. This is a week after the inauguration. These are diplomatic calls. Hello, how are you? Exchanging pleasantries. And so he says to Malcolm Turnbull how unpleasant his call has been with him, and says Putin was more pleasant. Your response to that, and also how does that play with people saying, why does he never speak an ill word about our enemy over in Russia?
Yeah, well, this was again early on, as you know, just about a week into his presidency. So we have to keep that in mind. But yeah, he continues to be reluctant to criticize Putin. And here he is in a very contentious call with one of our most closest allies, certainly in the Asia-Pacific region, if not in the world, Australia. It's also important to remember that this deal, I mean, I get the political reasons why he didn't like it, but I was working for John Kerry when we agreed to this. And it didn't tie the United States' hands at all. It said that we would agree to vet these individuals, and it wasn't 2,000, it was about 1,250. We would agree to vet them and could make the final decision about whether they could come into the United States. And President Obama deferred that to President Trump. So he had an option here. It wasn't being just thrust upon him.
But in addition to that, Sabrina, the examples apparently he brought into the conversation, terror attacks, he brought up the Boston bombers, he brought up San Bernardino, and one other that's escaping me. But the point is, those terrorists were not refugees. To me, it just underscores the point. Did he even have an entire understanding of what the policy was with Australia to begin with?
No, not particularly. And I think that one thing that's notable here is that when this conversation was reported on widely at the time, Trump had, in fact, as was mentioned, called it fake news. And in fact, it turns out that the characterizations we read in the press were accurate. Look, he's someone who has not shown himself to be particularly interested in the policy nuances. Again, it goes a lot more back to perception. So he is more concerned with this idea that he vowed to bar refugees coming into the United States, and he doesn't really take the time to examine what the implications of such a proposal would be and how the policies have manifested themselves in other countries. He also has similarly been critical of other U.S. allies, such as Germany, Angela Merkel in particular, and France and Canada for having accepted millions of refugees. And so I think that he doesn't really take the time to understand what the specifics are of the threats that we face from a national security perspective. It has more to do with appeasing that base and that those people who did propel him into office, in part because they do have hostile attitudes towards immigrants. And that, again, goes back to the way that he is communicating about both the wall as well as refugees in these two conversations.
I think you hit on the word. It's perception. It's not just the people's perception of him and promises, but it's also the press's perception. And he continued to call, what did he call us, the enemy of the American people, being we, the media. But he sure seems to care how the media is covering him based upon both of these conversations with world leaders. Admiral Kirby, Sabrina, and David, thank you so much. Thank you. We're going to move on. Coming up next here on CNN is the U.S. closing in on a new military strategy in Afghanistan. Sources telling CNN that the president is growing frustrated about how the situation is there. And today, sharp words from Senator John McCain on his first week getting cancer treatment. He is speaking up. He is blaming the failures in Afghanistan on a particular group of people. We'll take you live to the Pentagon for that. Also just in, he wanted to address the American people directly. But we just learned moments ago, Anthony Scaramucci, the man who sat in that top spot of the communication shop at the White House for 11 days, is canceling his live event suddenly. We're going to tell you what he planned to do, and we're wondering why. This, as we also have audio of Scaramucci's profanity-laced conversation with the New Yorker's Ryan Lizza joining us live. Lots to talk about on this Thursday. You're watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin.
Impressive, Lynn. President Trump is now facing some serious criticism over comments he made during a phone call with the Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. The Washington Post released a full transcript of that call, which came just a week after his inauguration back in January. While talking about stopping the flow of drugs into the United States, the president also said this, and I'm quoting him, "I won New Hampshire because New Hampshire is a drug-infested den," close quote. Joining us now from Capitol Hill is Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat from New Hampshire. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I should point out, first of all, that President Trump actually lost New Hampshire to Hillary Clinton in the general election. He did win the Republican presidential primary there. You had a very harsh response on Twitter to what the president told the Mexican leader. You called his words disgusting. Or what's your message to the president?
Well, his words were disgusting. They're an outrage. And my message really is this. He should stop insulting people and instead work with us to get the resources to our state and states all around the country who are also challenged by this epidemic so that we can roll up our sleeves, get people more medication-assisted treatment, and work together to beat this thing. And, you know, what we've seen from the administration so far is efforts that would actually undermine what we've done so far. The administration's attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which had Medicaid expansion. In New Hampshire, we have bipartisan Medicaid expansion, and people on the front lines of this epidemic say that's the #1 tool they have to combat the epidemic. And then you see the president's budget, which would defund critical resources for our ongoing work here. So my message to the president is simple. Stop insulting people, learn about this illness, and help us combat it and beat this epidemic.
Because he has established a task force to deal with opioid-related deaths. The New Jersey Governor, Chris Christie, is directly involved. Other top officials are directly involved. Have they consulted you? Has the president asked you for your thoughts or anyone senior in the administration?
Well, they certainly consulted with a group of us who are senators from states where this epidemic is particularly challenging. But my message here is let's stop the talk and let's get to action. People are dying every day from drug overdoses and from this epidemic. We need to come together and do what the experts in the field already have identified as critical actions. The interim report by the President's Commission made recommendations that are action items that I've been supporting for a long time. The National Governors Association rolled out similar recommendations now a couple of years ago. This isn't about talk, this is about action. And I would invite the president to learn more about this, but more importantly, to commit to providing the resources to New Hampshire and other states who are challenged by this epidemic so that we can beat this thing and save lives.
Is there any serious prospect of bipartisan cooperation in the Senate now that repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has failed? Any prospect of bipartisan cooperation to try to improve, to fix some of the serious problems of Obamacare?
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, you heard Senator Alexander and Senator Murray, chair and ranking member of the Health Committee on which I serve, announce that we were going to have hearings in September about how to make the improvements that Democrats have been calling for some time and hoping to work with Republicans on. And, you know, Democrats and Republicans have been working on the opioid crisis together as well. Senator Young and I have both successfully put into the FDA reauthorization some critical work to make sure that doctors know about the dangers of something called abuse-deterrent opioids. So we have been doing some work together, and there is bipartisan interest in particular on the opioid crisis. It affects people from all walks of life all across our country, and we really need to be coming together and helping people get healthy again.
Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Good luck. Up next, President Trump is set to unveil an aggressive new approach toward China and its trade policies, and China's already pushing back. We have new information right after the break. Transcripts of President Trump's phone calls with key allies are threatening to derail a major reset week for the White House. The calls are contentious. During one, President Trump tells the president of Mexico to stop publicly saying he won't pay for the wall. The president's call with the Australian prime minister is even more tense, with the president saying at one point it's, quote, the most unpleasant call he's had with a foreign leader yet, and that includes his conversations with Putin and with Angela Merkel. He later says, and I'm quoting him now, this is ridiculous, this is crazy. He says that to the Australian Prime Minister Turnbull before quickly ending the call, even though Turnbull wanted to discuss Syria and North Korea. With us to discuss, our CNN political director David Chalian, Washington bureau chief for the Daily Beast Jackie Kucinich, and former State Department spokesman, Pentagon press secretary John Kirby as well. David, you've read through these transcripts. I've read them. Your immediate reaction?
The first thing that jumped out to me about the Mexico phone call was that the president was not, and remember, he was president for 8 days at the time, I believe, but the president was not arguing for Mexico's payment of the wall on principle. It was purely he didn't want him to talk about it in the press. He was so transparent, much more so than he has been publicly with the American people, in his call with the Mexican leader, that this was a political problem for him if the veneer, the sort of sheen that he put out there about Mexico will pay for the wall, that his big campaign rally line will be turned into a lie if Mexico keeps refusing to do this. He wasn't arguing for the payment on principle. And of course, it also made me wonder instantly, tonight he has a campaign rally in West Virginia. What is he going to do with that line tonight? And is the crowd going to be around a chant about Mexico paying for the wall?
Because every time the president said, at least don't talk about it, he said, well, look, the Mexican president, Peña Nieto, said, you know what, we're not going to pay for the wall. Forget about that. That's a non-starter. I can't do that. It was a very contentious.
They have gone on to lead very productive lives in this country and have children who have been very highly successful in this country. And so